Some encounters change lives forever, and others expose the truth hiding in plain sight. When a black elderly woman is harassed by police officers who don't know who she is, one phone call flips the script in a way no one saw coming. What happens when the wrong person is pushed too far? Before we get into this jaw-dropping story, let us know in the comments, have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Evelyn Marshall didn't need much from the world these days. At 73 years old, she had lived through enough injustice to recognize it before it even reached her doorstep. She had seen it in the way people locked their car doors when she walked by, in the way store clerks followed her just a little too closely, and in the way neighbors glanced out their windows when she strolled down the block in her Sunday best. Some things never changed. But this was different. Evelyn had just finished her weekly grocery run at a small local store, one of the few businesses that hadn't been swallowed up by gentrification. The plastic bags dug into her fingers as she walked slowly toward her car, her back aching from years of carrying burdens that weren't hers to bear. She had just placed her bags in the trunk when she heard it, a short, clipped whistle, the kind that wasn't meant for animals or friends, but for control. "Ma'am." Evelyn turned, adjusting her glasses, her brows lifting as she took in the sight of two uniformed police officers approaching her. One, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes. The other, shorter, younger, rookie energy all over him, shifting on his feet like he wasn't sure why they were even stopping her. "Yes," she asked, her voice polite but firm. "Need to see some ID," the taller officer said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. Evelyn frowned. "Excuse me?" "Just a routine check, ma'am," the rookie cut in, his tone softer but unsure. "We got a report about suspicious activity in the area." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. Suspicious activity? She had lived in this neighborhood longer than most of the houses had stood. She had watched the streets change, had seen the faces shift from familiar to foreign. But suspicious? The only thing suspicious about her right now was the color of her skin to men who saw threat where there was none. "And what activity might that be?" she asked, crossing her arms. The taller cop lifted his chin. "Just show us some ID and we'll be on our way." A flicker of heat stirred in her chest, a familiar anger she had spent years taming. She had heard these words before. She had heard them when she was 16 and walking home from church, when officers claimed she matched the description. She had heard them when she was 35 and pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. She had heard them all her life. Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. "I'm just an old woman trying to get home with my groceries. You see my car, you see my bags. What exactly do you think I've done?" The taller officer smirked, leaning slightly toward her. "Just following procedures, ma'am." Evelyn's fingers twitched at her sides. "Procedures for what? Existing?" "Ma'am, we're gonna need you to cooperate. And I need you to tell me what crime I've committed." That did it. The taller cop stiffened, and for the first time the rookie looked uncomfortable. Maybe he was starting to realize this wasn't routine at all. Maybe he was questioning why they were harassing a grandmother in a flowered blouse, with aching knees and a tired soul. But the taller officer? He had already made up his mind. His hand hovered over the radio at his shoulder. "Are you refusing to comply?" There it was. The threat, the unspoken warning that things could go sideways real fast if she didn't play her part. Evelyn took a slow breath. She had survived Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, redlining, and a lifetime of being treated as less than. And yet, somehow, she still had to justify her right to be in her own neighborhood. She reached into her purse, not for her ID, but for something far more powerful. Her phone. The rookie tensed, watching her movements, but she didn't rush. She had learned long ago that sudden moves could cost people like her their lives. She scrolled through her contacts, tapped a name, and held the phone to her ear. The taller officer frowned. "Who are you calling?" Evelyn didn't answer. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice. Sharp, professional. "Mum?" A slow smile curled at the edges of Evelyn's lips. She tilted her head slightly, letting her eyes linger on the officers just long enough for doubt to creep into their expressions. "Hello, baby," she said, her voice light, conversational, like she wasn't standing in the middle of a grocery store parking lot being interrogated for simply existing. "I seem to be having a little trouble here." The taller officer shifted. "Ma'am, we—" Evelyn held up a finger, silencing him. She continued into the phone. "Couple of officers stopped me, asking for ID. No real reason given." A pause. Then, the voice on the other end sharpened. "Where are you?" The taller officer's smirk faded. He exchanged a glance with his partner. The rookie's face had gone pale. Evelyn turned, giving them both a slow, measured look. "Oh, just outside Thompson's Market." Silence. Then a clipped, professional response. "Stay put." Evelyn smiled, slipping her phone back into her purse. "Oh, I will." The taller officer's confidence wavered for the first time. Who was that?" Evelyn adjusted the strap on her purse, taking her time before answering. Then, with a voice as steady as a judge's gavel, she said, "My daughter?" She let that settle for a moment, watching as confusion flickered across their faces. "And what does your daughter do?" the rookie asked, almost afraid of the answer. Evelyn gave him a long, knowing look. "She's the United States Attorney General." The words hit the officers like a hammer. The taller one stiffened, his lips parting slightly like he had just realized he'd stepped off a cliff. The rookie swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "Evelyn?" She just adjusted her glasses and smiled. "Now, officers," she said, her voice cool, controlled. "Would you like to see my ID, or would you rather wait for my daughter to arrive?" For the first time that day, neither officer had a thing to say. The silence between Evelyn and the officers stretched uncomfortably. The taller cop, whose face had been set in stone just moments ago, now seemed to be calculating. The rookie shifted uneasily, his fingers twitching at his sides like he wasn't sure if he should stand firm or back away completely. Evelyn, on the other hand, was perfectly still. Not afraid, not panicked, just watching. "Ma'am," the taller officer started, clearing his throat, "we're just doing our job." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what job is that, exactly?" The officer squared his shoulders again, as if trying to reclaim whatever authority had just slipped from his grasp. "Making sure everything checks out." Evelyn let out a quiet chuckle, one that wasn't amused but full of understanding, the kind of laugh that said, "I've seen this before. I've seen you before." "Well," she said, adjusting the strap of her purse, "I suppose we'll see if everything checks out when my daughter gets here." A muscle ticked in the taller officer's jaw. The rookie's eyes darted around like he wanted to find an escape hatch in the pavement. "You don't have to call anyone," the taller cop said, his tone shifting from hard authority to something just a little too forced, like he was trying to smooth over a situation he'd only just realized was spiraling. "We can—" "I already did." Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The power of her words alone sent a ripple through the air, making the officer stand a little straighter, a little more uncertain. The taller officer licked his lips. "Ma'am, look, we weren't—" "You were," Evelyn cut in, her voice calm but firm. "And you still are." A few feet away, a small crowd had started to gather. The grocery store had always been a place where neighbors ran into one another, where conversations stretched out longer than they should, but now the energy was different. People had stopped pushing their carts. An older black man in a plaid button-up stood with his arms crossed, watching. A young mother held her child's hand tightly, shaking her head. A cashier in an apron peered from behind the glass doors. The officers noticed, too. The rookie took a half-step back, suddenly hyper-aware of how many eyes were now fixed on them. The taller officer, though, wasn't ready to back down completely. Not yet. He turned toward the growing crowd, offering them a tight, almost rehearsed smile. "Folks, there's nothing to see here. Please, go about your day." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The weight of the moment hung over them like the pressure in the air before a storm. Then, the sound of a car approaching fast. The sleek black sedan pulled up so quickly it was almost as if it had materialized out of thin air. It stopped just a few feet away from where they stood, the hum of the engine slicing through the tension. And when the door opened, stepping out was a woman who commanded the street without even trying. Tall, poised, and dressed in a dark navy suit, her presence swallowed the scene whole. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to adjust her stance. The moment she shut the car door, she owned every second of what happened next. Her eyes, sharp, piercing, the same deep brown as Evelyn's, locked onto the officers. "Which one of you put your hands on my mother?" Her voice was the kind that made rooms go quiet, that made powerful men shift uncomfortably in their seats, that carried weight and history and a promise that if there was injustice, it would be answered for. The taller officer's confidence, already cracking, shattered completely. "No one put their hands on her," he said quickly, stepping back, his posture a stark contrast to the authority he'd tried to wield just moments ago. "Good," the woman took a step closer, "because if you had, we'd be having a very different conversation right now." The rookie took another step back, barely breathing. The taller officer, though? He was still trying. "Look," he started, his voice losing its edge. "We didn't know who she was." Evelyn's daughter, United States Attorney General Vanessa Marshall, tilted her head slightly. Her expression didn't change, but the shift in her body language said enough. "I'm sorry, what?" The officer swallowed. "We didn't know." "So you mean to tell me," Vanessa said, her voice like a blade being drawn from its sheath, "that if my mother wasn't my mother, if she was just another black woman minding her business, you would have treated her differently? Is that what you're telling me?" The officer opened his mouth, closed it. He had nowhere to go. Vanessa didn't wait for him to answer. She turned slightly, scanning the small crowd of people still watching. "How many of you know my mother?" she asked, her voice reaching everyone without effort. A chorus of voices responded almost immediately. "She's been here longer than anybody. She taught at the elementary school for decades. Everybody knows Miss Evelyn. She watched my kids when I had to work late." Vanessa turned back to the officers. "These people, they knew who she was, and yet you didn't. You assumed, you harassed her, and now, what? You want to explain it away? You want to act like it's just a misunderstanding?" Neither of the officers said a word. Vanessa took another step closer, her voice quieting just enough to make them lean in. "Let me tell you something," she said. "I have spent my entire career holding men like you accountable. I know every law, every policy, every loophole you think you can hide behind. And if you think for 1 second that this ends with you walking away without consequences." She let the sentence hang there, unfinished. But it didn't need finishing. The promise of what came next was enough. The taller officer straightened, as if he was about to say something, but Vanessa had already turned away from him. She faced Evelyn now, her face softening in the way it only did for her mother. "You okay, Mama?" Evelyn, who had remained still and patient throughout the entire ordeal, nodded with a small smile. "I'm fine, baby," she said, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's arm. "Just tired." Vanessa exhaled through her nose, some of the tension in her shoulders loosening. She nodded once, then turned back to the officers. "You two," she said, "are going to hand over your badge numbers and full names right now, and then you're going to go back to your department and let them know that this," she gestured between them, "is far from over." The rookie didn't hesitate. He pulled out a notepad, scribbled down his information, and handed it over. The taller officer? He hesitated just a fraction too long. Vanessa didn't flinch. "I will make one phone call and have your entire precinct on their knees before sunset. Do you really want to test that?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line, but he handed over his badge number. Vanessa took the papers, tucking them into her pocket like they were nothing more than receipts. Then, without another glance at them, she turned back to Evelyn. "Let's go home, Mama." And just like that, it was over. Or at least, for now. The moment Evelyn and Vanessa left the grocery store parking lot, the world outside had already started to shift. It wasn't just another case of police harassment that would disappear into the folds of the news cycle. Not this time. By the time they reached Evelyn's home, a modest, well-kept house with a porch swing that had held more memories than some people had years, Vanessa's phone was already vibrating non-stop. Texts, emails, calls, people who knew, people who had already heard, people who wanted statements. Evelyn watched her daughter navigate it all with that same calm, steely presence she had always admired. It didn't matter that she was one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. To Evelyn, she was still the little girl who used to sit cross-legged on the floor, highlighting passages in law books too heavy for her tiny hands. Vanessa finally let out a breath and placed her phone face down on the table. "Well," she said, rubbing her temple, "I hope those officers enjoy the next few hours, because they have no idea what's coming." Evelyn sipped her tea, watching her daughter carefully. "What exactly is coming?" Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, the kind of expression that usually preceded a courtroom dismantling of an entire case. "Accountability." Evelyn exhaled slowly, setting her mug down. "And what does accountability look like this time?" Vanessa leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. "Internal Affairs is already on it. The precinct is under review. Body cam footage will be released by tomorrow morning." Evelyn shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "Body cam footage," she echoed. "That's what it takes now? Proof?" Vanessa's jaw tightened. "It shouldn't." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It shouldn't." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of history pressing down between them. Evelyn had lived through too much to be naive. She had seen men in uniforms with more power than they deserved walk away from worse. She had seen people protest, beg, demand justice, only to be handed excuses and unfortunate misunderstandings instead. And yet this time, she had something she never had before, a daughter with the power to change the ending. Vanessa's phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up. She barely had time to say hello before the voice on the other end launched into a frantic spiel. Evelyn could hear the urgency, the clipped, anxious words spilling from whoever was on the other end. Vanessa nodded once, twice. Then, "Send me the statement, I'll approve it." She ended the call, took a breath, and looked up at her mother. "It's already everywhere. News stations are covering it. Social media's running wild. They're calling it grocery store profiling." Fielding let out a small, tired laugh. "They had to give it a name, huh?" "They always do." Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, but Evelyn knew that wouldn't last. She had seen the looks in people's eyes back at the store. She had felt the shift in energy. This wasn't just about her anymore. Vanessa stood, rolling her shoulders back. "I need to make a few calls. This isn't just about those two officers. It's bigger than them." Evelyn nodded, watching as her daughter stepped into the living room, already moving, already strategizing. This was what she did. She took injustice and turned it into battle plans. She took violations and turned them into legal reckonings. Evelyn picked up her tea again, but before she could take a sip, there was a knock at the door. She wasn't surprised. When she opened it, she was met with familiar faces. Neighbors, friends, people she had known for years, and some she barely recognized, but all of them had the same look in their eyes. Anger, support, determination. "Miss Evelyn," said Mr. Green from 2 houses down, his voice rough with something that wasn't quite rage but was close enough. "We heard what happened. We're not letting this slide." Evelyn sighed, stepping back and gesturing for them to come in. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It never was. Within minutes, her living room was full. Conversations overlapped, voices rising and falling with shared frustration, with questions about what came next. Do we protest? Do we demand those cops get fired? We can't let this be another one of those stories that just fades away. Vanessa reappeared from the hallway, her presence commanding the room the second she stepped into it. The conversations died down, all eyes shifting to her. "I know everyone's angry," she said, voice firm but measured, "and you should be." She looked around the room, taking in the faces, the concern, the exhaustion. "This isn't new," she continued. "We all know that. My mother knows that better than anyone." Evelyn felt the weight of her daughter's words, the truth in them. "But here's what we can do," Vanessa went on. "We make sure this doesn't disappear. We make sure those officers are held accountable, and we demand better, not just for my mother, but for everyone else who doesn't have a daughter sitting in the U.S. Attorney General's office." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "We have the media's attention," Vanessa said. "We use it. We let them tell the story, but we make sure it's our story." Evelyn watched as the people around her, people who had felt helpless for so long, began to sit up straighter. A woman near the doorway, someone Evelyn recognized from the local church, spoke up. "What can we do?" Vanessa's gaze swept across the room, her mind already moving 100 miles ahead. "Show up. Speak up. Share the footage when it drops. Write. Call. Make them listen." The energy in the room shifted again. No longer just frustration, but action. Evelyn sat back, watching as her daughter took control of the storm. She had always been strong, but now she was unstoppable. Vanessa took a deep breath, glancing at her watch. "I need to go back to D.C. by morning, but before I do, we make sure the next steps are clear." Evelyn smiled softly, proud, even through the exhaustion. The battle had begun. And for once, the ending wouldn't be written by the same hands that had always held the pen. The next morning, the city was awake before the sun. The story had exploded overnight, traveling from social media to national news in the blink of an eye. The video from the grocery store, recorded by a bystander who had quietly captured the entire exchange, had gone viral. The footage showed everything. The way the officers had approached Evelyn without cause, the way their tones had shifted once she made that call, the way their postures stiffened when Vanessa arrived, her presence alone enough to unravel their confidence. And now there was no stopping it. By mid-morning, news vans lined the street outside Evelyn's home. Reporters huddled on the sidewalk, microphones in hand, waiting. They weren't alone. The community had shown up too. People stood in groups holding signs, speaking in low voices. They weren't protesting, not yet, but they were there to make it clear this wasn't just another headline. Inside, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, watching as Vanessa moved through the room like a strategist preparing for battle. Calls were made, emails were sent, statements were drafted. Vanessa had done this before, but never like this. Never for her own mother. Evelyn reached for her daughter's wrist, stilling her movement. "Vanessa." Her voice was calm, the kind that had always been able to steady her daughter, even when she was a little girl pacing before a spelling bee. Vanessa finally exhaled, setting her phone down. "I know, Mama. I need to slow down." Evelyn chuckled, shaking her head. "You don't know how." Vanessa smirked, but said nothing. She knew her mother was right. A knock at the door sent a ripple through the house. Evelyn and Vanessa exchanged a glance before Vanessa moved to answer it. The moment she opened the door, the man on the other side took a careful step back, hands clasped in front of him. "Attorney General Marshall," he greeted. His badge was clipped to his belt. His suit was crisp, his expression unreadable. Evelyn recognized the look instantly. A man sent to control a situation he no longer had a handle on. Vanessa nodded once. "Chief Reynolds?" The police chief cleared his throat. May I come in? Vanessa glanced past him, noting the two officers standing at the curb, eyes lowered, hands resting near their belts. Then she stepped aside. Evelyn didn't stand, didn't move. She simply watched as Chief Reynolds entered, his eyes flickering briefly to her before settling back on Vanessa. "Let's get to it," Vanessa said, folding her arms. The chief hesitated before pulling out a chair across from Evelyn. "I want to personally apologize for what happened yesterday." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" The chief blinked. "For the way my officers treated you." Evelyn nodded slowly. "And how exactly do you think they treated me?" There it was, the weight of accountability hanging in the air between them. The chief shifted in his seat, clearing his throat again. "I reviewed the footage," he admitted. "It was unacceptable." Evelyn stared at him, unmoving. Vanessa leaned against the counter, arms still crossed. "Unacceptable," Vanessa repeated, her tone unreadable. "That's the word we're going with?" The chief's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, and I want you to know, we're taking action. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." Vanessa's lips parted slightly, the faintest trace of amusement flickering in her eyes. "Leave," she echoed. "Paid, I assume." The chief hesitated. "For now, yes." Vanessa let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Chief, let's not play this game. We both know how this works. Leave means nothing. It's a pause button, not a consequence." The chief sighed, rubbing his temples. "What would you like to see happen?" Vanessa straightened, her stance shifting from casual to commanding in an instant. "Termination." The chief's eyes flickered with something unreadable. That's the bare minimum," Vanessa interrupted. "Your officers profiled my mother. They harassed her. They would have escalated if she had reacted the way so many others do, if she had been afraid instead of composed. We both know that." Ellen watched as the chief took a slow breath, as the weight of Vanessa's words settled in his chest. "I understand," he said finally, "and I'll take that into serious consideration." Vanessa's jaw clenched. "That's not enough." The chief met her gaze. "Then what do you suggest?" Vanessa didn't hesitate. "A public statement, full transparency, the release of body cam footage, uncut, and I want those officers to answer for their actions." The chief nodded slowly, as if turning the request over in his mind. Then finally he exhaled. "I can do that." Vanessa didn't look relieved. "Not yet." "And the officers?" The chief hesitated. "They'll be dealt with." "That's not an answer." The chief held her gaze. Then, after a long pause, he nodded once. "They won't be back." Vanessa studied him for a moment as if gauging his sincerity. Then she nodded. "Good." The chief turned to Evelyn, his expression softer now. "Mrs. Marshall, I truly am sorry." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice even. "I've heard that before." The chief swallowed. "I know." Evelyn studied him for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod. The conversation was over. The chief stood, adjusting his suit before offering Vanessa one last nod. "You'll have my statement by the end of the day." Vanessa stepped aside, allowing him to leave. The moment the door shut, the weight of the room shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it loosened. Vanessa turned back to her mother. "Well?" Evelyn took a slow sip of her tea before answering. "We'll see." Vanessa let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible." Evelyn smiled. "And you're relentless." Outside, the world was still waiting. The cameras, the community, the eyes of everyone who had ever been stopped, questioned, doubted, just for existing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for once, Evelyn didn't feel powerless. For once, she wasn't just another name in another story with the same ending. This time, the ending was still being written.